Rugby on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, main sponsor of the Irish rugby team. We all belong to the team of us.
Welcome along. It is time for us to look forward to the United Rugby Championship Semi-Finals, which are on this weekend. Around 23,000 tickets have been sold for the rivalry being renewed between Leinster and Munster in the All-Irish Semi-Final, while Connacht are on the road there in Cape Town in South Africa for their match against the Stormers at 3 p.m. Irish time tomorrow. Delighted to say that Cian Tracey is here with me. Cian, how are you getting on?
Oh, good, Will. Just walked in from outside. Sun is splitting the stones. Fingers crossed it'll be like that tomorrow for the Aviva. It would be brilliant if you got a dry track like that, wouldn't it?
It has that feeling. It's the end of season rugby where generally you might get a bit of a sunburn going to the Aviva over the next
even
couple
like there's you can see people are outside the pubs in the Dublin streets now already. Like there's just a whiff of summer in the air. So yeah, fingers crossed we get the weather, especially considering what it was like yesterday, monsoon like. So yeah, it's all set up well.
They officially announced today that the Heineken Champions Cup tickets are entirely gone. It's effectively been a sellout for a few weeks, but officially sold out now. As I mentioned, the outset, 23,000 sold for tomorrow. Is that a little bit disappointing, maybe?
I think it is, yeah. So obviously the capacity for tomorrow is going to be capped at 29,000. And I have to say, even when I saw that, I was a bit, disappointed. I mean, maybe it's, it clearly was wishful thinking in terms of getting a big crowd. Obviously, there's loads of different factors to that. The cost, involved. A bit of maybe Aviva fatigue in terms of the Leinster supporters, Munster supporters not exactly having great memories up in Dublin, but you think of Munster Leinster games, the great ones over the years, and packed out houses, hottest ticket in town, and yeah. So when I saw 29,000, I was a bit disappointed. And now when you're kind of looking at the 23,000 mark, I think it is. I just think these two teams and the rivalry to have deserve a little bit more. But with the Champions Cup final next weekend, it's not ideal. Like if you think back to the URC last season, the way it fell, Leinster played the Bulls in the semi-final the week after they lost in Marseille. So I don't know if it's something that will be looked at going forward. But like personally, I've always kind of felt like that the Champions Cup final should be like almost a Champions League in football, that it should be the last game of the season because it is kind of the centrepiece. So we don't have two fully stacked teams. Obviously, there's injury issues for Munster, but it's difficult for Leinster when they have the biggest game of their season next weekend. So lots of different factors I think playing into it. I'm sure the 23,000 or whoever many do turn up on the day will make for a great atmosphere, but it's a little bit disappointing when you think about what it has been over the years.
Munster, this is a great opportunity for them. It's only a few weeks ago we were talking about how it was going to be difficult to maybe get a result or two results in South Africa that looked like would be required to be 100% cast iron into the playoffs. Now they've come through into a semi-final against the Leinster team, who understandably have got an eye and a half probably on the Champions Cup final, even if Leo Cullen says it's the next game. You look at the selection that's been picked by Leinster too. They have picked a team with La Rochelle in mind the week afterwards. Does this represent a massive opportunity for Munster to get to a final?
I think it does, yeah, for sure it does. I think just the big disappointment from a Munster point of view is that the Glasgow win was so costly in terms of the injuries. Now, there are a couple of bonuses in that Diarmuid Byrne and Peter O'Mahony are fit, which is absolutely huge. And I think the biggest shock of all is that Keith Earls is playing. I certainly wasn't the only one who was hearing that he could potentially have played his last game for Munster with that injury he picked up. The word was that it was pretty bad. So it's absolutely brilliant to see him back, particularly with Calvin Nash being one of those with HIAs who's going to miss out. And Nash has been brilliant this season. So what a player to call upon, and even it's very timely for Keith Earls in terms of the World Cup picture as well. I think lots of people have been too quick to write him off. He's a firm favourite of Andy Farrell. He's had a really, really badly disrupted season in terms of injury, but if he gets back, puts in a good performance, I think the Ireland training squad for the World Cup is going to be named the week after the URC final, so it would be timely for him. So it is a big opportunity for Munster. It absolutely is. Munster will want to play it down in terms of being the underdogs, and they still are, despite the team that Leinster have picked. But if you look at the players that Munster are missing, so Calvin Nash, like I mentioned, Malachi Fekitoa,
RG and Conor Murray. These all four.
Exactly, yeah. And Conor Murray's been outstanding in the last few games, and RG Snyman just so unlucky, can't catch a break, but he's exactly the kind of guy who you want in your pack going up to Dublin. But I suppose that is offset by the fact that Leinster have not picked their first choice 15, as you said, Will. And if you look at the team that they've picked, you'd probably say two players realistically might start next weekend, maybe Ryan Baird as well, but I'm thinking Jimmy O'Brien and Jack Conan you'd imagine will be starting next weekend. Leinster don't want to take any chances. That's totally understandable. I think for all that winning the URC would be like massive for them, Leinster, like if we're being honest, judge themselves off the Champions Cup, and rightfully so, and they've underperformed in Champions Cup, so clearly they have one eye on that, but they've still picked a strong team, and probably a little bit stronger than I was maybe expecting, with the likes of Conan and Jimmy O'Brien starting. It's interesting that there's no Jordan Larmour in the 23. I don't know, does that point to him maybe having a big involvement for the La Rochelle game next weekend? Personally, I would have thought Jimmy O'Brien was kind of nailed on. Obviously James Lowe hasn't been proved his fitness in time. Perhaps they're looking at him to return next weekend. So look, Leo Cullen and Stuart Lancaster have done a brilliant job, you'd have to say, over the years of managing their squad, and even still, like, it's, if you were to call it a second choice Leinster 15, it's still unbelievably strong. So while it is an opportunity for Munster, I still think it's a formidable task. Yeah,
we'll take a look at those selections and we can dig into the detail then. So Leinster going with Jimmy O'Brien at fullback, and the rest of their backs: Tommy O'Brien, Robbie Henshaw coming back in, I would think, with the idea of getting minutes into the legs ahead of next week. Charlie Natai, got Dave Carney in what could potentially be his last game for Leinster at the Aviva. Harry Byrne gets the nod to start at 10. Luke McGraw will captain the team from scrum half, and then the pack. So you've got a front row of Michael Millen, Ronan Kelleher, very important for him to come back for his first Interpro since January. Ala Alatoa being the other side. Baird and Jenkins are in the second row, and then there's a back row of Max Deegan, Will Connors and Jack Conan. Some experienced players on the bench, including the World Player of the Year, Josh van der Fleer and Cian Healy. Munster have gone with Mike Haley at fullback. Keith Earls, Anton Frisch, Jack Crowley and Shane Daly are going to be across the back three and the wings there. Ben Healy and Craig Casey are playing as 10 and 9. So Crowley will be in the centre, but also covering 10, as we'll talk about in a moment. Then you've got Jeremy Loughman, Diarmuid Byrne, Stephen Archer, John Klein, Tyg Byrne. Peter O'Mahony passed fit despite that arm injury that he had to captain the team from the back row, which also has Hodnett and Gavin Coombs. So we look at the split even on the bench for Munster here, and what really stands out to me on this one, Cian, is that there's no Joey Carbery at all in the matchday 23 at a time when Crowley and the soon to depart Healy will both be starting in the game. Yeah, it's look, I don't know, do I want to use the word big surprise? It's not a big surprise because Joey Carbery hasn't been selected in the last few games, but like someone like Malachi Fekitoa has been there, so you would have imagined with him out that it would have created a space for Joey Carbery to be on the bench, but they've gone with Rory Scannell, who can play 10, but he's been far more of a 12 for the last years. I think he played 10 in his underage days. So yeah, look, this is just a continuation, I think, of a really tough, disappointing few months for Joey Carbery. He's clearly fallen down the pecking order. He's now third choice 10, can't even get into the match day squad. It's like, on a human level, I think it's really disappointing and sad to see it happen. I don't, like, I find it interesting because I don't necessarily think Joey Carbery has been terrible by any means to not justify being in the 23 for a game like this. Now clearly we're not privy to how he's training behind the scenes, and I think he got married earlier this week in terms of his, you know, having the reception, which of course he's entitled to, but week of a URC semi-final, and knowing you're coming off the back for quarter-final, it's interesting timing for sure. Maybe he has an injury that we're not aware of, but I was down in Limerick on Tuesday at the press conference and there was no mention of an injury. There was no mention of an injury in the bulletin that Munster would send out. So look, yeah, it's curious. It's like, where does Joey Carbery go from here? Personally, even when he lost his place in the team, I was still thinking that he's going to be in the World Cup frame, but certainly in a training squad. But right now, you'd have to say, when Eddie Farrell picks that squad after the URC final, that Joey Carbery probably isn't going to be in it. We can get on and we can talk about Harry Byrne, but you look at a guy like that now is getting a start in a URC final. He played in the URC quarter final. Has he now overtaken Joey Carbery in the pecking order? So it's really difficult. Like, next season he's going to have, you know, a chance the slate will be wiped clean to a certain extent because Ben Healy is leaving, and that's also an interesting dynamic to this as well. Look, Graham Rowntree and Mike Prendergast, who obviously, you know, is the attack coach, are certainly right to pick the best team for now, but when a guy is leaving at the end of the season and you still can't get in ahead of him, that's a real kick in the teeth, I think, and it's going to be really difficult for Joey Carbery, I think, mentally as much as anything, to bounce back from that. Maybe a summer off, you know, just to refresh wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, because look, clearly Joey Carbery is still unbelievably talented. Lots of people would still say the fullback is his best position. Does he end up looking down that route? I'm not so sure, because Ben Healy, like I said, is going to be gone next season, and Munster need cover at 10 because they seem like they're putting all their eggs in the Jack Crowley basket now, even though he is playing 12.
like you said. So surprised not to see him in there, I think. But it's really disappointing, I think, from Joey Carbery's perspective, for sure.
Yeah, because once it was very clear that Healy was signed, he was going to Scotland, he went away with their Six Nations camp. Then there was obviously the bad news that Joey Carbery got, that he wasn't going to be involved with Ireland for the best part. Now, he still got back into the training squad during the Six Nations, but to me it seemed very clear that Healy was going in one direction, and if you're Munster and you're going to back Joey Carbery into next season, you would have had Carbery finish the season out, particularly if they are interested in keeping Crowley at 12 and having a look at him as a centre ahead of next season. They played him like in midfield quite a bit of the year. You would think that you'd back Carbery then if the intention was to play him next season. Yeah,
lots of teams, I think, in a similar scenario would tend to kind of not freeze the kind of departing player out, but they would certainly put in more of their focus on guys who are going to be there next season, and that's understandable. But look, Ben Healy's been playing really well for Munster off the bench. Like he actually deserves his start at 10. He's arguably been better than Jack Crowley in the last few weeks. So it's just such an interesting kind of dynamic, because if Ben Healy plays well tomorrow and we'll say masterminds, a Munster win over Leinster, then all of a sudden, Munster are kind of going, whoa, did we make the right decision here? And I have such admiration for Ben Healy in making the decision that he did. He clearly wasn't in the Irish shake-up, and despite the fact that he was for Munster, my understanding is that he chatted with Andy Farrell. He was upfront and honest with him, which again, you'd have to admire Andy Farrell for that, rather than keeping a guy here if he's got no intention of playing him. He's gone away. He's already been capped by Scotland. If the Scottish World Cup squad was being picked in the morning, Ben Healy's nailed on to be in it. So you've got to back and admire a guy for being ambitious to,
especially when Gregor Townsend has now signed a contract irrespective of what happens later this year. And he's been, I wouldn't say a cheerleader, but he's clearly been a very big fan of him. He spoke about how he can be a very important player for Edinburgh next season too. So he obviously is a admirer, and you would think if he's put that much stock into him and convinced him to declare to play for Scotland, he's probably nailed on to go to the World Cup.
Yeah, it was a bit of love. He showed a bit of love, didn't he? And sometimes that's what players want. And like I said, Ben Healy is a young guy. He has international ambitions. If he felt like he was going to be in Munster and not getting a look in with Ireland, he was dead right to go away and follow his dream of playing international rugby, and now that's with Scotland. So, but at the time when he made that decision, he was firmly third choice in the pecking order at Munster. So you'd kind of wonder what's going on in his head as well. Again, I'm sure he's perfectly happy with his decision, and like I said, fair play to him. But the dynamic has shifted a lot in the last couple of months, and I don't think Ben Healy or most people would have seen kind of the fall from grace that Joey Carbery has had.
Yeah, when we look at the Leinster team, the headline news is the fact that Robbie Henshaw is now going to go back in, get some game time ahead of the European final, and for Ronan Kelleher to be working himself back into fitness too. That's the big boost for them, is they're going to get minutes into the legs of both those players.
Absolutely huge. I think Robbie Henshaw had a minor injury, but at the same time it cost him 2 games out in terms of the last 2 games. So he's had such an injury hit season, and I was actually chatting to him during the week for a piece in tomorrow's paper, and we were just kind of charting kind of how unlucky he's been at different times of his career. Now, he's got savage miles in the clock when you think of how young he broke through with Connacht. He was capped by Ireland at 19. He's been such an unbelievable player over the years, but his body has taken some punishment over the years. It's actually cost him a lot of big games along the way as well, but what a player to be able to bring back in. And for sure, I think if Robbie Henshaw had played that Toulouse game even, we probably wouldn't have seen him start tomorrow. But it's really important, like you said, Will, to get some minutes into his legs. Playing 13, which is interesting, because you'd imagine he's going to be playing 12 against La Rochelle with Gary Ringrose playing 13. But Charlie Natoy, in the last few games, we've seen number one, we've seen how good Leinster's recruitment is. They were chasing Natoy for quite a while. Arrived as a Challenge Cup winner from Lyon. Not the flashiest player in the world, but my God, he's been impressive and been so important to Leinster, particularly with Henshaw out. So bringing him back in, playing at 13, he'll have a bit more space. And I'd imagine Munster will probably look at Jack Crowley playing 12. He's done well at 12 all season, but he's definitely a more natural 10. And I'd imagine he's going to have Natoy and Henshaw running down his 12 channel a lot. In terms of Ronan Kelleher, it's kind of similar to Henshaw, really, isn't it? In terms of his career has been a little bit stop-start, and Dan Sheehan has gone to such heights that I'm not going to say Ronan Kelleher has become the forgotten man, but
He's a battle on to get his place.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of distance, I would say, now between the two of them. But when they're both fit and firing, what a duo to call upon, particularly from an Irish point of view. You'd imagine going into the World Cup. So massive to have him back as well. And like, he's going to want to remind, I think, Leo Cullen and Andy Farrell as well, like, you know, that he hasn't gone away, and that, you know, all this talk about Dan Sheehan, which is fully justified, by the way. Dan Sheehan is one of the best hookers in the world at the moment. But such luxury, isn't it, to be able to call on like a player like that. And interestingly enough, Dan Sheehan isn't on the bench. They've gone with John McKee in the bench, so he's been firmly wrapped in cotton wool for that La Rochelle game, which is no surprise.
McKee's come off the bench, I think. Ulster, definitely the Leicester. He's come off the bench the last 3 or 4
He's come off
weekends.
the bench, but it's like when Dan Sheehan is tended to play, I did a piece on this earlier in the season, he plays serious minutes. It tends to play nearly the full 80, not the full 80, but he plays a lot more than your average hooker would play. So you'd imagine Kelleher would probably play 50, 60 minutes, John McKee to come off the bench, depending on how the game is going. But if Kelleher comes through it unscathed, you'd imagine he'll be on the bench, and against that La Rochelle pack, it'll be very important to have someone like that to call upon, I think.
Charlie Nadai was talking to Brian Driscoll about him last week, and he said probably the most impressive thing about the way that he played against Toulouse in the semi-final is that he's almost coming in off the cold, because Leinster generally will play the Ringrose Henshaw partnership where available, and Kieran Frawley had covered a bit when Nadai was injured earlier in the year, and he kind of was half expecting Frawley to be brought in, but said that he was tremendously impressed by both sides of the ball. Very good tackling, physicality within that game, and he showed he's got that bit of invention about him too. I think of that really, really clever 50-22 kick that he took at one point in the first half, which just relieved pressure at a time that Toulouse were playing well. He slotted in very nicely at a key part of the season for them.
Yeah, and I think he's a goal kicker as well. We haven't seen it yet, but I'm pretty sure he's been goal kicked throughout his career. So yeah, look, he's been so important. Like I said, not the flashiest player. I think he's got one cap for the All Blacks, but Leinster have been tracking him for quite a few years. So
probably going back to when he was at the Chiefs.
Leo Cullen, I think, spent time at the Chiefs, I think, in his younger days as a coach, I'm pretty sure. So there's a bit of a connection there. Obviously James Lowe came from the Chiefs as well. So Leinster are very clever in that regard. I mean, they've got a strong relationship with the Crusaders as well. Obviously Andrew Goodman has come in, but during lockdown in particular, they were sharing lots of ideas. So you imagine Crusaders and Leinster are pretty much the two strongest clubs in the world. So like, what an alliance to have. So that's very, very interesting the way Leinster go about that. But I think the ability of Charlie Nadai to come back and hit the ground running. There's a few players in Irish rugby that do it. Henshaw actually is one of them. Johnny Sexton is another one. They're guys you're not really overly concerned that they don't have a lot of game time. They just manage to come back, slot back in seamlessly and hit the ground running. But I think that's a testament to what the work that goes on behind the scenes with Leinster. This is something that Henshaw was talking to me about in terms of the chat that I had with him. You know, the physios, the strength and conditioning coaches, the guys who don't really get a lot of the credit, but like, you think of how attritional rugby is these days, they play such a massive part in that. And it also points to how high the standard, I think, is in Leinster training. I mean, we've all heard of Stuart Lancaster's Tuesday sessions where they run the legs off them, but that all counts when players are coming back from injury, and it just works so well. So Nadai's the latest to do it, and it means that they don't have to play Gary Ringrose in a game like this. They can relieve him with his feet up ahead of next week as well.
Harry Byrne starting this time round. This time last year, going to Marseille, I was on the flight, the team were in front of us, and Harry Byrne was sitting there as a non-playing substitute, so he was going along in that capacity. Obviously, look, there's been a lot of hype about Harry since he was an under-20 international. He's come off the bench a few times in recent weeks. Johnny Sexton's injury has given opportunity to his brother Ross primarily, but also to Harry, who's got more game time in the last few weeks of the season. We're now getting to see Harry Byrne in important cup rugby.
Yeah, I can't believe you're on the Leinster private jet, Will, over to the...
I wouldn't quite call it the private jet, but it was the flight that I booked, and we ended up with as about 15 or 16 of the Leinster players. They basically brought their entire squad, everyone who played in the Champions Cup.
Which is right. They all, like, I mean, they all play a part in it. But yeah, like, Harry Byrne, you'd have to say probably has become the forgotten man, but it just shows how quickly the door can reopen, and this applies, I think, to an Irish context as well. Look, he has a bit of work to do, but we've just spoken about Joey Carbery, how much he's out of the equation. Harry Byrne is now backing up a semi-final URC start, having started the quarter-final as well. So if you think back to Leinster in previous years, they've actually started Ross Byrne in lots of URC or Pro 14, Pro 16, whatever finals, and not had Johnny Sexton, because Ross Byrne has been the one to play. So I wonder if everything goes to plan from a Leinster point of view, would Harry Byrne even get to start in the final, which would be very, very interesting. So I think he's been quite quietly good. over the last few games that he's played. I don't think it's been anything sensational, but it's just good to see him playing and seeing his body hold up, because that's been the big thing for Harry Byrne. His body just hasn't been able to withstand the rigours of, you know, top level professional rugby. I think back to New Zealand last summer. This is something I was writing about during the week, and I'd arrived at North Harbour, which was Ireland's base, just in the outskirts of Auckland, and rocked up for one of the first training sessions when we arrived, and you could kind of see Ian Henderson standing at the sideline in a knee brace. You were going, okay, his tour is clearly going to be over before it even started. But Harry Byrne was standing next to him as well, and as it had turned out, he had torn his hamstring in training, and he was soon followed home on a plane. And that tour was being kind of built as a chance. I know, my understanding is he was penciled in to start that first Maori game at out half. Obviously then Kieran Frawley came in, and at the time it kind of felt like a bit of a sliding doors moment for both players' careers, because you kind of thought, wow, Kieran Frawley could really kick on here as a 10, but Leinster don't see him as a 10, even though Andy Farrell does. So that's an interesting dynamic as well. But the thing about Harry Byrne is Andy Farrell has picked him like fairly consistently when he's been fit. Obviously Jack Crowley has come onto the scene and done really well for Ireland, and he's definitely ahead of him in the pecking order as well. So Johnny Sexton's injury, like I said, shows how quickly the door can reopen, and what an opportunity for him to start in a massive game against Munster at the Aviva Stadium. And I think having someone like Luke McGrath will be massively important. He's going to captain Leinster. He's a guy, you know, I couldn't put him in the category like Rhys Ruddock and a Dave Carney, guys who kind of keep the show on the road, kind of the less heralded guys, and he's going to be massively important as well, because obviously Jameson Gibson Park isn't involved. So huge opportunity for Harry Byrne to impress, because the windows to impress Andy Farrell are narrowing now, but this is, you know, one of the last that he's going to get.
Yeah, Dave Carney, you mentioned, very emotional in the announcement that he made this week, where it seems he's going to Chicago. Nick McCarthy's also about to declare for the USA in another American rugby story, but it looks like Dave Carney is on his way to Chicago. This could well be his last game at the Aviva Stadium for Leinster. We don't know, maybe they get to the final. He could well be involved in the game there, not to write him off too early. But as you say, a very long serving player, and a guy who you require, I think, at different points in the season to add that experience in. Rhys Ruddock's a fantastic example of it too, where they've been so important. International experience, top level players, but there maybe when some of the others are being rested for international duty. Yeah,
and I think they'll miss him from that regard. Again, he might not be the most glamorous winger, and he might have been, you know, a bit underappreciated, I would say, by people outside of Leinster. I think people, even Leinster supporters themselves, would speak very, very highly of Dave Carney. You know, it's obviously difficult. He's in the shadow of some extent to his older brother Rob, who
Joe Biden didn't give him a shout out. That's the problem.
That's why he's going to America. Sure, Joe Biden's pulling strings behind the scenes to get Dave Carney over, but he's been brilliant. And I think, look, the Leinster conveyor belt is chugging on, and they have so many back three players who are coming through. Even you think to the Irish under-20s, you know, who won the Grand Slam this year. So there's no fear about the next crop coming through, but the likes of Dave Carney and Rhys Ruddock, like you touched on, Will, are so important to kind of, you know, making that transition easier for the younger guys coming through. So he'll be missed. He'll be hoping it's not his last game. And, you know, again, I kind of touched on the fact that Leo Cullen has been pretty loyal to guys who've done well in the URC Pro 14 over the years. I wouldn't be surprised if Leinster beat Munster tomorrow and they get to a final, if Dave Carney gets it started.
Some of this core group might play again.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that Leo Cullen does really, really well. Like I said, Ross Byrne is a good example of that. I can think back to a couple of finals, semi-finals that Ross Byrne played when Johnny Sexton was fit. Now I can't imagine, you know, I wouldn't like to be the one telling Johnny Sexton he's not playing in a game as big as that, but Leo Cullen handles it very well, so I wouldn't be surprised if he does back a lot of these guys. And look, Dave Carney showed his value again last week in that Sharks game. His kick through for Jameson Gibson Park's try was sensational. I mean, if James Lowe or someone does that, it's probably getting more credit than you know he did it for it last week. So he's been really, really important, and like I said, he'll be missed. And it sounds like he is off to America, and like great way for him to finish out his career, similar enough to Rob when he went to Western Force Super Rugby. So good luck to him.
Yeah, Rugby Here and Off the Ball is with thanks to Vodafone, main sponsor of the Irish rugby team. We all belong to the team of us. Now, Connacht have given themselves their trip to South Africa on the back of a huge win in Belfast last week. Andy Friend naming the team earlier today. No great surprise, Cian, that the same 23 will be trusted to play this game against the Stormers. On the face of it, it's difficult. Stormers away from home, third in the URC this season, have been consistent over the last 2 years. But Connacht have given themselves an opportunity with that really good performance last Friday night.
Yeah, absolutely. You say no surprise in unchanged 23, but it probably is a surprise because it's so rare in rugby nowadays that you see an unchanged team. I think I saw earlier on Twitter, and going to credit them, I think it was the Craggy Island podcast, the local podcast in Galway, said the last time the last time Connacht had an unchanged 23 in the URC was for the final in 2016.
Wow.
So
that's a good omen or not, I'm not sure.
That's a gem of a stat that I can't take any credit for, but that's a nice little omen to have, isn't it? We all know what happened in 2016 when Connacht beat Leinster and won the Pro 12. So yeah, look, it's remarkable that they were able to name an unchanged 23, because I was up in Belfast last week for the win over Ulster, and my God, we talk about the attrition of the Munster-Glasgow game. Munster have, the depleted bodies to show for that. But we were talking to Jack Carty after the match, and he said there's a lot of lads down in the dressing room battered and bruised. It was such a physical game. So one of those occasions where you imagine people are just, sucking it up and getting on with it, because this is such a massive game. We were chatting to Andy Friend earlier on today, actually, from their base in South Africa, and they seem like they're in great spirits. I think Andy Friend strikes me as a guy you'd want in your corner for weeks like this. Like, nothing really phases him. They've obviously had the long haul flight. They left on Tuesday, they arrived on Wednesday. I think they trained on Thursday, and they've just tried to make it as normal as they can, even though they had to travel 18 hours to go to Cape Town. So look, it's going to be a very difficult task, but I think Connacht are quietly optimistic that that they can cause an upset. It's going to require something really, really special to beat the Stormers, who let's not forget are the URC champions. They'd love nothing more than to defend their title. They've been pretty good this season. They're tough to beat at home generally, but Connacht, I think, will take a lot from the win that they got in Ulster last weekend. No one gave them a chance then. No one's really given them a chance tomorrow either. So. And
sometimes a team comes into the playoffs in good form, and that's the case with Connacht. They finished the season out really well in the last month of it. So that would be the argument. I was reading through Andy Friend's quotes earlier on today, and he was talking about this kind of internal belief that was there, that last week, and it's not kind of stick up in the dressing room style stuff. He's saying, look, last week we were considered underdogs, but we had a belief within our team that we're now playing to a system that's playing good rugby and effective rugby, and we're going to go out and do the exact same thing against the defending champions tomorrow. So you look through that team as well, lots of experience. You mentioned Jack Carthy, the fact that Farrell, I think, is in for his 99th cap this weekend too. Tiernan O'Halloran playing a full-back. Like, these are guys who've been around and about this Connacht squad for quite a while. Quite a few of them still there from the URC, or what should we call it, the Pro 14. It was a Pro 12 at the time, back in 2016.
It is hard to keep up.
We've been through quite a few name changes in the last 7 years, haven't we? But when you look through that squad, like, there's lots of experience. Even Dennis Buckley, Dave Heffernan being able to play within the front row for this weekend. That is probably as strong as Connacht have finished out a season in quite some time. Yeah, and three guys you did mention, they have Bundy Aki, Mac Hansen and Finlay Bealham, who were part of a Grand Slam winning team, and I don't think you can underestimate the importance of that, of Connacht having three guys like that. Mac Hansen played every minute of Ireland's Grand Slam campaign, so having that kind of winning attitude, because for ages it was Bundy Aki was pretty much the only one coming back to camp, and he probably got a little bit frustrated at different times because he expects such high standards when he comes back from international camp. But now you have the likes of Bealham and Mac Hansen, who, by the way, have both been brilliant this season. Finlay Bealham was so unlucky that he picked up that injury at Rome. He was having a brilliant Six Nations when Tadhg Furlong was out injured, but he's been sensational for Connacht this year. He's really, really transformed player, and the coaches deserve huge credit for that. So they've got a winning mentality now within their squad, and it feels like the culmination of the 5 years of hard work that Andy Friend and the coaches like Mossy Lawler, who's obviously going to Munster at the end of the season, Dewald Senecal, who's done such a brilliant job with Connacht set piece, particularly their line out. He's leaving to go to Oyonnax at the end of the season. Cully Tucker is staying on. He's done a really good job with the scrum. So it's disappointing in one sense that this is going to be the end of the journey, not necessarily tomorrow, but in the next few weeks, that certainly the band is going to break up to some extent. Now you have Pete Wilkins, who I should have mentioned as well, is going to be staying on obviously as head coach, and you will have him to smooth the transition somewhat. And they got the recruitment work done pretty early when it comes to big signings, and then getting Muldoon in, getting Fardy in. A lot seems to be in place for Connacht already ahead of next year. Yeah, and there's Sandy Cordero is coming in, one of the most exciting wingers in the world, and you always go back to Andy Friend's comment that he made a couple of years ago that they have to shop in Aldi when everyone else shops in Brown Thomas. Or you bring in an incredible player and you sell Galway to him. Absolutely. I saw it the other day actually on social media that Connacht were trying to sell
people season tickets, and they were flagging, "No, just don't forget that this guy is on his way next season."
Get your Argentine shirts ready.
Yeah, but like he's the type of guy who'll get people off their seats, and he will get you down to the sports ground. And now that they have the 4G playing surface, that it will play to his strengths. So there's lots of good things happening in Connacht at the moment. You think to the new training centre that they're building, which will be ready in the not too distant future as well. So things are changing in Connacht, and Andy Friend has just been such a brilliant, I think, figurehead over the last couple of years. You think back to the kind of disastrous spell really they had under Kieran Keane, and he's really steadied the ship since then. Hugely popular. No player is going to say they don't like their head coach, but anytime you hear the Connacht players speak about Andy Friend, you can really sense the warmth that he and the regard that they hold him in. So he will be a loss, but he was talking about it earlier on in the press conference that we were chatting to him with, that he's doing his best to take the emotion out of this. I'm sure deep down there is, there's something stirring in him, but he doesn't want to see tomorrow as kind of the last step in the journey. He wants to see the last step in the journey being the 27th of May, wherever that the final may be. So look, Connacht are in bonus territory. I don't think that's being disrespectful to them, particularly after the tough start they had to the season. You remember their pitch wasn't ready at the start, so they were on the road.
It was so difficult. A lot of hard teams away from home to start the season.
And if you had told Connacht today and our Connacht supporters that they'll be in a semi-final going to Cape Town tomorrow, they would have snapped your hand off for it. But now that they're there, they want to make the most of it. It's a free shot, but Connacht are there on merit. You know what I mean? They beat Ulster, who finished second in the table. So it's a massive opportunity for them. It's like I said, it's going to be really difficult, but I wouldn't be writing them off.
Yeah, and look, so much is made as well about the amount of former Leinster players that went across the Connacht over the last 2 seasons. But you see someone like Niall Murray, local lad from Roscommon. He's got himself into the URC Elite Team of the Year, whoever they're branding it this year. I think it's called the Elite Team of the Season or something like that. But to be able to bring those guys through, to see someone like Seamus Hurley-Langton put in Player of the Game performance last week as well. Connacht have managed their talent very well.
They have, and it is brilliant to see like the homegrown players, because that is an important part of the Connacht fabric. No different to Leinster, Munster and Ulster. It's really important to have homegrown players, and someone like Niall Murray, I still have to stop and check myself. It just doesn't seem right, but seemingly the people in Roscommon and him himself, he wants to be called Murray, so we have to go with that. But it's unbelievable to have a player like that from Roscommon, not exactly a rugby stronghold. I know Dennis Buckley is from there as well, and Niall Murray's younger brother Dara has been playing for Connacht as well this season. So it's so important that I think Irish rugby as a whole taps into these areas, and it's not just Galway, it's not just Limerick, Cork, Dublin, that you spread the net far and wide, because you don't know the kind of athletes that are out there.
I remember that was very much Pat Lamb's philosophy when he went to Connacht originally, because I remember he brought training sessions around the province at the time, and it kind of, there is that risk of it feeling slightly token, that it's let's go around to rugby clubs maybe where things aren't strong. But he genuinely was like, if we get a few fans to come from these areas and we pick a player up, that gives Connacht an opportunity which they haven't had before.
This is it's such an interesting topic, and it's probably like one that you could get into in another day for a podcast for itself. But you think of even Leinster and the areas of Dublin even that they could tap into. You look, I think the football team does it particularly well. So there's so many areas in the country that are untapped, and like I said, you can imagine guys now, from and girls of course, from Roscommon, they're seeing this guy playing in a URC semi-final. It has to be inspiring. It can be a bit of a cliche that you're inspiring the next generation, but you really are. And it was interesting, Niall Murray was speaking during the week, and I think he was asked about the 2016 final that we were referencing. He didn't even remember watching it because he wasn't into rugby at the time. So he's very much a late developer, and that's another sort of lesson in this story as well, that there is room, there is scope for late developers. So Connacht have to do that because they just don't have the playing pool. And that's a testament, I think, to the talent ID scouts that they have, because certainly Niall Murray was not mapped. I know he went on, he played for the Irish under-20s, but before that, he wouldn't have been a guy like, we'll say, James Ryan or Gary Ringrose, who were flagged coming through as, future superstars. He was coming
through in the club system in Buccaneers as opposed to the school system.
It's absolutely brilliant. I think it's vital for Connacht. It's a great part of the story as well.
Yeah, the team that they're facing, obviously the Stormers have got a tremendous amount of strength. You look at the amount of Springboks who are across that team going into tomorrow as well. There's a huge ask. I'm playing up how well Connacht have played the end of the season, but you look at that Stormers team on home soil, on the back of a win in front of a big crowd last week too. There's a big task to try and get through.
It is. They're missing two key players in Dean Furey and Marvin Orey. So Dean Furey is one of their best fetchers in terms of jackalers at the breakdown. So he's a big loss, vastly experienced as well. So I think that'll be an area. It's going to be such a key area anyway for Connacht. They were unbelievable at the breakdown last weekend in Belfast. They really blew Ulster away. They adapted better to Andy Brace's interpretation of the ruck, and that's going to be important tomorrow. Mike Adamson is the ref. Who, let's put it bluntly, likes to let things flow. So I think it's going to be very important that Connacht adapt to his interpretation. And then you have Marvin Orey, who's basically the Stormers line-out leader. And we've just spent the last couple of minutes, kind of praising Niall Murray, and we haven't mentioned the fact that he's taken over the line-out responsibility for Ulster, and he's been he's the top line-out stealer in the competition. So he is vitally important. And without Marvin Orey there, I think that's an area that Connacht will feel more confident in as well. But look, I think the front row is where the big test is going to come. You mentioned the Springboks that the Stormers have with Kitchoff and Malherbe, who is one of the best tight heads in the world, Joseph Dweba at hooker. So it's a big ask for this Connacht front row. But like I said, Finlay Bealham has been outstanding this season. Dennis Buckley was very good. He won a couple of penalties in Ravenhill last week, and then Dave Heffernan is vastly experienced as well. So I think if Connacht can get parity up front, particularly at the scrum, they're in with a good chance. The other thing that's worth mentioning, Will, is apparently the pitch is in shocking condition, and that's been a feature of the South African home pitches throughout the season. It's something that they really need to get their house in order. And I don't know if you remember Munster playing in Durban a few weeks ago against the Sharks. The pitch was shocking. It was like a cabbage patch, and players are going to get injured on this if something isn't done about it. So it's something Andy Friend was referring to on the call earlier, that they're going to have to be mindful of that. Of course it's the same for both teams, but it really shouldn't be as bad as what it is. So the Stormers have been selling tickets for something like €2 to try and get the crowd in. It worked really well for them the last time. So look, I wouldn't imagine there'll be a huge pile of Connacht fans. I've seen a couple of hardy bucks who are gone over.
You're
from
a committed
Connacht
fan now. If you put your hand in your pocket and go to
fair
Cape
play,
Town.
like anyone who's making that trip, fair play, because what a trip it would be, like in terms of as away from the rugby as well. But it all feeds into the mentality that the Connacht will feed off, that no one is giving them a chance. So I think they'll relish that. Yeah,
I mean, last year we saw Ulster wilt a little bit in their semi-final, so Connacht are going to have to kind of play both the occasion, play the conditions, play everything really. I mean, even a few weeks ago we saw Munster in the heat in South Africa really struggled as well.
The good thing is, though, it's not at altitude. It could be a lot worse. So, in terms of going to South Africa, if you were going playing on the high veld, at the Bulls in Pretoria or something, then that's a different kettle of fish. So, like I said, Connacht arrived on Wednesday. They're trying to keep the week as normal as possible. They would have had Wednesday off anyway. They train on Tuesday. They train in South Africa on Thursday. Captains are on today. So, I think it all comes from the positivity that Andy Friend kind of exudes in these circumstances. It would be easy to, be complaining about having a short turnaround, have to go and make an 18-hour flight, but Connacht are relishing it, and that makes them dangerous. I
wonder on the reverse side how things are going to work out for the South African team. So very much the feeling from the URC board this week was that these clubs will all be fine for next year. We've got our teams locked in and we're 100% confident the league is going to be fine. It's just very difficult for the South African teams when you see the challenge that they've had going through the Middle East to go to Europe, long trips which many of them have highlighted, and then when you mix in the amount of travelling that's been there for the Champions Cup on top of that as well. This is quite a slog for those teams in South Africa right now.
Yeah, like before I kind of get into that, I think we should point out that the South African teams have been brilliant for the URC on a purely rugby basis. Like
on a sporting basis they've added to the competition.
It's been brilliant, and I think it's the URC has gotten a lot more respect now since they've joined, so that's been brilliant. But like, I personally struggle to see how this is sustainable in the long term. I think it's brilliant for now, it's all going well, but even from a climate point of view, from a player welfare point of view, I mean, I don't know if you saw the pictures that the Lions players put up on Twitter a few weeks ago when they were coming back from Europe. You had giant props squeezed into economy class on planes, and it could be easy for people listening to snigger at that, but when guys
the financial reality, if you're going a long way around to get back home and you're stuck into cattle class coming back and you're recovering potentially from a knock or you're getting ready to go back to training, all these little things make a difference.
Yeah, and like player welfare is now more important than ever. So I think I heard Connacht had 5 business class seats and they were going to the 5 biggest players, so you can imagine there was a bit of a battle to relax.
Whether you're proper or second row deserves the seat.
But you know what I mean, but that is like we laugh about it, but that's that's the reality of the situation. And unless you're like the Sharks had to do some amount of travelling in the last few weeks towards the end of the season, and unless you're in that situation, I don't think you realise how difficult it is. So look, it's been brilliant from a rugby perspective, but I would have my concerns in the long term where this is all going, to be honest.
They might have to have a look at just how things work for the European Cup particularly. I know we've had changes around the seedings and qualification and everything coming out this week, but I kind of wonder if we get to a point where for the South African teams particularly, they had to travel to Europe for the knockout stage games. It's one of those kind of messy ones where you don't know if you're going to win the round of 16 or quarter final. So it's, do you camp in Europe for a couple of weeks? Do you go back to play your URC games when there's teams coming for a 2-week break? Do you split your squad? I'm not sure what the solution really is.
Yeah, I think the reason that the South African teams didn't have home advantage was some pre-arranged agreement, but that's not obviously sustainable going forward. If you earn home advantage, then you should have home advantage, and home advantage in South Africa is, like, home advantage anywhere is really important, but more important, you'd have to say, than ever going to South Africa. And the other kind of thing is, you know, like rugby is not in a good place financially, and you kind of touched on it there, Will. The finances involved in, you know, flying teams, you know, halfway around the world is...
My understanding is because of a sponsorship arrangement, that's why they're going through the Middle East. So it's like the only way of making these trips to Europe sustainable is that way, because they couldn't afford to send them to London.
And I was talking to Noel McNamara a few weeks ago, who is obviously the attack coach with the Sharks from Clare. Any listeners are not aware of him, you know, came through the Leinster system, really highly regarded young coach, Irish coach. But he was telling me, you know, a couple of weeks ago they were coming back and they missed their connection flight, and then all of a sudden your week, it's not just, you know, coming home, your week is disrupted. So these are all the things that we don't get to see about, we don't get to hear about, because we're totally focused on the Irish side of things. But the South Africans have had a tough time of it at different times. Now this is what they signed up for, and you can't really have too much sympathy for it. But in terms of, you know, going forward, it is messy. It really is, I think.
Yeah, time zone works out, the distance doesn't really work out.
And that's it. Like the viewers, I think, in terms of the TV and all that, have been really good, because they're not playing in Super Rugby, so that like you said, the kickoff times are far more friendly. What is it, an hour time difference? So that works. But there's been plenty of games as well that we've seen on TV where there's been poor enough attendances as well. So I touched on it there. The Stormers are selling tickets, basically giving tickets away. Now I know the Rand isn't great in South Africa.
It's hard as well, you know, when those rivalries aren't in place already. Yeah. So like maybe Leinster are interesting because you've watched them in European finals and so on. But when you're bringing teams that rivalry isn't there in the same way that they were with the teams in Australia and New Zealand, that'll take time to form.
Of course it will, and hopefully it gets the time to do it, you know, because like we said, we touched on earlier in conversation, the URC, the Pro 14, it's been through so many different guises that this is probably, you really like the Welsh teams to get their house in order in terms of making it more competitive, but it's been a really, really good league, you'd have to say, for the last couple of years, and looking forward to the last 2 weeks of it now.
Yeah, no, it should be really good. Couple of busy weeks coming up between the URC Semi-Finals and the Heineken Champions Cup, which will be live here and Off the Ball between Leinster and La Rochelle next week. Rugby here and Off the Ball is with thanks to Vodafone, main sponsor of the Irish rugby team. We all belong to the team of us. Cian, thanks a million.
Thanks a million.
Rugby on Off the Ball
with Vodafone, main sponsor of the Irish rugby team. We all belong to the team of us.